Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to use EventBridge Scheduler to create an instance of an event that fires at a point in the future. And so we're going to be using Lambda functions for this example, but before we even get into that, there are a couple things to know about how EventBridge Scheduler works because it's kind of confusing when you set this up and it took a lot of trial and error to get right. So let me walk you through what we're going to be doing here and some of the things that we need to run through. So we're going to be using a setup where we have two different Lambda functions. This Lambda function is going to be responsible for creating the instance of the event in the EventBridge Scheduler service. So in the middle here is EventBridge Scheduler. You could just call this EB or whatever you want. And so this Lambda function is going to be kind of creating that instance of the event. And maybe it'll say like, the current time is 5 o'clock. I want to trigger an event at 6 o'clock or something like that. So it'll be passing in some arguments that say, okay, 6 o'clock is when I want to trigger it. And then it also needs to pass in the ARN of this Lambda function over here to say that, this is the thing that I want to trigger once 6 o'clock comes by. And so that's not a confusing part. That's pretty kind of expected. The confusing part is in terms of the IAM permissions that are required to make this whole thing kind of work. And so the first one is kind of expected. So for this Lambda function, which is going to be the thing that creates the instance of the event, you're going to need I think it's called the scheduler, and it's a create schedule permission. So scheduler, create schedule. And I'm going to show you how to create all these things. So this isn't kind of surprising at all. So it's scheduler, create schedule. Now the one that is surprising is this one, which is called IAM and it's pass role or something like this. The exact name I'm going to have to look up, but I'll show you how to do this. And so the reason that you need this one, which was the confusing part of this whole setup, is because in the input, when you call the create schedule API, you also need to pass in a role ARN, And the role is something that you need to create in advance. And the reason that you need to provide this role ARN is because when 6 o'clock rolls around, which is the trigger moment for this Lambda function, EventBridge Scheduler needs the permissions to invoke this particular Lambda function. And so when you initially set or create the event, you need to initially create a role and then pass in the ARN of this role to EventBridge Scheduler so that it can be used later to invoke this Lambda function. And so you need to give this Lambda function here, which is calling EventBridge, the permission to pass the role to the EventBridge service. And this is basically saying like, I am giving the permission to EventBridge to assume this role at a later moment in time so that I can invoke our Lambda function here. So that makes sense, but there is an extra layer to this, which makes it a little bit more confusing too. The second part is that this particular role that you create also needs some permissions, right? So it needs the permission to invoke your Lambda function. So it's invoke function, I believe is the policy name, Lambda invoke function. And then it also needs the ability to be assumed by the EventBridge service. So you need to set up a trust policy so that EventBridge can assume this role once 6 o'clock rolls around to invoke your function. And so you need, it's like STS assume role, and you need to provide it to the service name, which is like scheduler.amazon. Something over here, .amazonaws.com, something like that. But I'll show you the exact details here. I'll also show you the policies more specifically that you're going to need, or I'll give you a link to my article that talks about this in detail. So you can visit my website and grab all of this stuff so that you can follow along. Okay, so that's what we need to do here. And so I already did a little bit of setup. So let me get this off the screen for you, and then we can walk through some of the details here. Okay, so I have a Lambda function already that I created. This is going to be the receiver of the event at a later point in time. This thing doesn't do anything particular. It just kind of generates a random number, returns some stuff. Notice though that it does print the incoming event. And I'm going to show you how to set it up so that later, when this event gets invoked, when this kind of timed event at 6 p.m. or whatever gets invoked, you can pass it some arguments that are specific to this particular event so that you can react to it accordingly. Okay, so let's do that first Lambda function setup initially, because that's what we need to do because that's going to be calling the EventBridge service. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say create function. We're going to call this trigger, or timed trigger demo, something like this. We're going to be using Python for this. Now, despite the fact that I'm using Python, if you're using different language, like the concepts are all going to be the same, just the syntax is going to be slightly different. So don't worry too much about it. Let's go to create function really quick. And this should only take a moment. And then we're going to change the IAM role so that we have the right permissions to call the EventBridge Scheduler service initially, and then have the right permissions to pass along that role. And at the same time, we're going to create the role that we need to pass along to EventBridge too. So you're going to see all the IAM stuff done in one go. Okay, so this is our time trigger thing. So let's just get rid of this. We don't need any of this. I always like to put print event right at the top so that we can see what's coming in. Okay, perfect. So let's go to configuration. Let's go to permissions. We're going to go to the role name, which is this guy. And so we need to add the permission to do scheduler, create schedule, and then the IAM pass role. So by default, it just has a basic execution role, which is fine. Let's add permissions, create an inline policy. And let's do this. Okay, select a service. So first of all, we need the scheduler, scheduler service, EventBridge Scheduler. There it is. Going to go to right, and it should be create schedule. There you go. We're going to be using the default group here. So it's just going to inherit default. So if you want to create a specific one, you can put that, but we're not doing that here. You also need to say which resource. It's going to warn you if you don't put a particular resource. I'm just going to put all here because it's a demo. All right. Oh, wait, no, sorry. We need to, okay, this is just for EventBridge Scheduler. We need to add more permissions. This one needs to be for IAM, and we need the pass role permission, IAM, and I'm just going to type this because I don't know where it is. Okay, pass role under right. Okay, all resources. What you should probably do in real life is give it the ARN of the role that you're going to pass, but you'd have to create the role first in order to make this work that way. But I'm doing it the other way around, but you can do that in like a more production case. Anyways, let's go to next. And this thing is just called like EventBridge Scheduler demo. And, oh man, okay, just fix this really quick or else I'm gonna have a problem with it. Okay, create policy. And all right, so we got EventBridge Scheduler demo here. We can see it has the 2 permissions that we require. Perfect. Let's go ahead and create the role that we are going to need when we call the create schedule API and when we pass in that role ARN. So we're under roles. Let's just reset that, go to create role. And for this, we're going to just create a custom one here. We're going to go to custom trust policy. Then we can modify this role later, so it doesn't really matter. So let's go to custom trust policy. And then for the trust policy, we need to give it the permission to assume role. So that, okay, that's already here actually. And I'm just going to replace the principal with something I have on the side here, which is already copied and pasted and validated to work. And so the principal is the service scheduler.amazonaws.com. So that's what's happening here. So we can go ahead and go down now. Then we can add some extra permissions to this. And okay, permission policies. We may need to create one manually, then attach it to this. Unfortunately, I don't think it lets you. We can always, add permissions. Can we edit this? I think we may be able to. It doesn't let you create a role inline. That's really annoying. Okay, that's fine. Permissions boundary? No. Okay, let's come back into this in a second once we name it, and we'll give it that additional permissions. Let's call this the EventBridge Scheduler assume policy. And like I said, all these policies you can get on my website. I have an article on this entire thing, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Okay, so we named this thing create role. Okay, that's fine. Now let's find it. EventBridge Scheduler assume policy. We'll add a permission now. Add permissions, create inline policy. And so this is the one that's just going to have the Lambda function invoke access. So it is Lambda, and then it's this, and then invoke function. So that's what we want. And you probably want to set the specific resource that you want to, but we're not going to do that in this case. Let's go ahead and click on next. Give this thing a basic name. So Lambda invoke from EventBridge. Okay. And create policy. So that's the name of this thing now. So keep this handy because this is the role that we're going to need later when we call the EventBridge service and when we do so programmatically in our code within our Lambda function. And so before we do that, let's just confirm it's set right. So the policy for this role, let's see. Okay, it's Lambda function all. That's good. Trust relationships. It is able to be assumed by the scheduler service. So we are done in the IAM section of the console. We can get out of here. I'm just going to minimize this, and I'm also going to put something on my clipboard on the side, which is that IAM role, so we can get it back later. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go to our Lambda function here. Let's go to the code section and start modifying this to make sure that everything is set up right. So what I'm going to do here is just drop in some code and then explain things to you as we go. So let me just do that now. So don't be overwhelmed. It can be a little bit bit daunting at first, but don't worry, I'm going to explain to you exactly what is happening here. Okay, so line 1, we're just importing Boto3. We're also importing the UUID library, which is useful for a later purpose. I will tell you about that in a couple moments. We're also creating a instance of the scheduler client, just Boto3.client scheduler. We're setting the response here. We're calling the scheduler.createSchedule API. And first line here, it's commented out. I want to come back to this because this is an important new update in the scheduler API, but it's not yet supported in the Lambda version of Boto3, but we will come back to this to discuss it at the end. The first, and these are all mandatory settings, by the way. Everything I'm putting in here is mandatory, except I believe is time zone, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, flexible time window. What does this mean and why is it mandatory? So there's two modes. It's either off or flexible. And what this setting effectively means is that when their timer is hit, say at 6 p.m., you are giving the permission to EventBridge to invoke your trigger or your event. In our case, it's our other Lambda function with some jitter, like at a time not exactly at 6 p.m. Now, it's never exactly at 6 p.m. regardless, but when you put it in flexible mode as opposed to off, it's going to do it up to like a certain time range. So it could be up to a couple minutes, could be 15 minutes. You can set this as well if you happen to set the flexible setting to, set the mode to the flexible setting. But for our purposes, since we want this to be invoked at a particular time, then it makes sense to keep this as off because we don't want that jitter in here. Now, you may ask yourself, why does this even exist in the first place? And the answer is that in some cases, if you're scheduling a lot of events from like an application at a particular moment, say there's like 20 or 30 events that all are supposed to fire at 6 p.m., then you don't want to cause a phenomenon called stampeding, which is everyone all at once is trying to kind of like fit through a door. Say there's like a large crowd all trying to fit through a door at once. It's much easier if they kind of go, a little bit of a time delay in between each person so they can all get through single file or whatever. It's the same idea here. So with flexible time window, it basically will spread out your events within a range so that they're not all trying to be slammed in at once. And this is useful to prevent like brownouts of a service or degradations of a service. Say there's like maybe a database that you're hitting on the other end, like when this other Lambda function gets invoked. If you're all trying to invoke that Lambda function, which calls that database all at once, say there's hundreds or thousands of events all at 6 p.m., it can cause like connection, out of connection errors. It can cause a whole bunch of issues as well. So that's why you would use it, but we're not going to do that in this case. For the schedule expression, okay, so this is the one where you can specify how you want it to behave in terms of if you want it at a specific time, which is using this notation here, at, and then it's year, dash month, dash day, or DD, and then T, and then 17, which is the hour, minute, second. And so this is using the at notation where you have at, and then in the brackets, you have the timestamp. There's also other ones as well. Like if you want this to be recurring, so a recurring event that happens periodically over time. So you can say like 1 minute in here, 1 hour, 1 day, 6 hours, 6 minutes, 6 days, whatever you want it to be. You can also set this up as a cron expression, which is kind of a cron job. And there's a special notation to make that work. So this is more useful if you want it to be like on weird times of specific days and have a pretty consistent pattern. Now, these two are for recurring events. So if you set this schedule or set this thing up once, it's going to trigger periodically at the specific intervals. But with this one, it's going to just trigger at this particular moment. So it's kind of like a fire and forget. The next thing that I put in here is the schedule expression time zone. It's just a UTC offset. So for me, I'm in UTC -4. And so I believe by default, it just uses normal UTC time, which is like in Europe, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. So that's the default, but if you don't expect that to be the case, you need to set it to the time zone that you want to use here. Okay, so for target is where you specify kind of how is the invocation going to work? Like what are the inputs that you're going to provide to whatever you want to invoke on the other end of it, which is that test function like I showed you over here. Like this thing isn't doing anything. It's just a random number generator that prints the event, at least for now. Anyways, in here, inside the target field, there's 3 required parameters. So the first one is the ARN, which is the ARN of the Lambda function. So this is equivalent to over here. It's just this value right here. And then you have the input. Now this can either be static or dynamic. So static being something that's just hard coded and this is what it is, or it could be something that's like based on the inputs to this particular Lambda function. Or you can say like a customer ID. And that's actually what I suggest here, because typically when we use this feature in the first place, it's because you want to do something later with regards to a particular ID. Say for example, like someone places an order on a website, maybe in 1 week you want to send them like a follow-up email, like a coupon code or something. You would put in the input the ID of the customer, and then on the other Lambda function that gets invoked at the moment, at whatever this moment is, you can read off this input and be like, oh, this is with regards to customer ID 1, and then look them up and send an email or whatever. So that's the setup here. And then there's the role ARN, which is the thing that we just created in the previous step. And we actually need to change this because this is not the right value. This is one that I was using for testing. So let me go grab that, which is why I put this in the clipboard on my other screen here. Okay, so we got that role ARN here. So that's all we need. And then the name, this is the other thing that's required as well. And you can see I'm doing something a little bit weird here. I'm doing a string conversion to a UUID. I'm calling UUID 4. Now, what this method does, if you've never used this before, is it generates a 32 character string that has random digits separated by dashes. And the reason that I'm doing this is because if you try to create an event, EventBridge Scheduler instance, so one of these with the same name, so test, for example, the first time it'll work, but the second time, since the name already exists, it will fail. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just giving this a random name every time so we don't have any kinds of issues. What I would suggest you do in real life is you give this a more descriptive name, like maybe something that's prepended with some useful information. So like maybe, I don't know, customer 1 dash, then the UUID here, where this UUID is the actual UUID, not the literal UUID here. So that's what I would suggest so that you can look this up later and audit it and figure out like, oh, did my event trigger or not? It's very easy to find. And then finally, the last thing we're doing is just sort of printing out the response. So that is all we really need to set this up. So we actually need to change this time for something more accurate. So today's the 12th. So I'm just going to change this. What time is it right now? Okay, it's 1:53 p.m. So I'm going to change this and we're going to say 13:55 just to give me some time. So 13:55:00. So that's 2 minutes from now. Let's do this quick before we run out of time. We probably got to make an event. Oh man, I'm on the clock here. I don't like this. Okay, we're going to go to deploy now. And okay, so that deployed. Let's test this now. Hopefully no errors. Okay, cool. So we got some stuff going on here. Let me just grab this and then I'll show you what's inside of it. There's nothing really like too special, but let's see. So I'm just gonna, this is my favorite website, by the way, just to format things. So all it says is response metadata, nothing important here. And then the schedule ARN, also nothing really important. This is the ID that we created it with. So this is the UUID. I know you can't see it, but that is the UUID. And so if you set this to customer 1 dash something, it'll be, whatever, customer 1 dash this. Okay, so what we can do now is go into EventBridge Scheduler to make sure that this exists. So I'm in the EventBridge section of the console. I'm under schedules. And let me just refresh this. And there you go. So we now see that we have an instance here. You see the name is the same. And so if we click on this, we can see the configuration of it. So you can see it's set for today at 13:55, which is exactly what I said. We can see the target, which is our Lambda function. We can see the payload. We can see the ARN that we're using, and also the role that is going to be assuming at, well, I guess in less than a minute now, at the invocation time, which should be pretty much right now. Anything else in here? So there's retry policy. You can set this stuff as well. There's dead letter queues. There's encryption. There's extra things that you can look at here. And okay, so let's just go and see if this invoked our function. And so this is our Lambda that should have been invoked by now. Yes, so it is 1:55 right now. So I'm going to go to the monitor section, and sometimes it doesn't trigger exactly at the moment in time. I've seen it up to 30 seconds later. So that's one thing to be aware of as well. So let's go to CloudWatch logs, and hopefully we have an instance of a log stream at this point. If not, we're going to have to refresh it and wait. Okay, it looks like we have one. So 2023, 9/12, which is today at 13:55. So this happened 11 seconds after 1:55, which is okay. And there you go. So hey there, which is exactly what we passed into our Lambda function here, or into EventBridge Scheduler, which triggered our Lambda function. Now, one important thing that I wanted to call out to just tell you about really quick before we wrap up this video is this thing in our code that I had commented out, which is this item here. Action after completion, which is set to either none, you can see none, or delete. Now, this is a very important feature because when EventBridge Scheduler was initially launched, and actually even to this day, you can only have 1 million different schedules, right? So 1 million of these, and that's a hard limit. You can't get that increase from what I could tell. And this is a problem because if you have a particularly chatty application that, maybe it creates an instance of a schedule for every order that gets placed or every customer or every, some recurring thing, you can very easily eat into that quota very quickly and then run out of space. And then your application is going to fail. And then you're going to have all sorts of problems. So that was a really significant issue. And I'm surprised they even launched the service in this condition. And so what you had to do previously is you had to set up like a timed job that would come to EventBridge Scheduler service and then clean up all the events that had already expired, which was just a waste of time for everybody. However, now with this new feature, if you look at this setting, action after completion, you can basically tell it to delete the event after the invocation occurs. And this is helpful because it allows us to prevent us from getting over that quota. And so we don't have to worry about this anymore. Keep in mind, if you have a lot of stacked up events that haven't triggered yet, then this can still become a problem. Like say, for example, you are scheduling like more than 1 million for tomorrow, then you're still going to have this issue because this isn't going to help, right? You're going to try to create more than 1 million events for a particular moment time in the future. It works better for like staggered events it's not kind of like a rolling window where you're creating it like T+1, T+2, T+3, that kind of thing. So keep that in mind as well. Now, the reason I have it commented out is because currently in the default Lambda Boto 3 library, they haven't updated it with the most recent version. So if you try to do this right now, this is going to fail. So let's just try this. I'll show you. But if you are using a deployment where you pull in the most recent version of Boto 3, so say you're using CDK or SAM or something like that, and you try to do this and you use the most recent version, there you go. So this is failing unknown parameter input action after completion. So you do need to use the most recent one. Hopefully they will change this soon. So maybe you can try this when you watch this video and it'll be fine. But for now, it is currently not supported. So that is it for this video. If you want the IAM policies and the code that I used here in this Lambda function, head over onto my website. I'll put the article link in the comment and description section below. And thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.